all I can tell you is that Nelson Antonio Denis, I have always known to be a straight up dude. La canta como la ve. He gets into a lot of trouble. Maybe it's me that I like that because he's gotten into trouble at the New York State Assembly, which he was a member of. He's gotten in trouble when he writes stuff, you know, because he's also has written editorials, is a great writer also. Evidence of that is this tome that you have that I suggest it's a must read. Because if you cannot bring yourself to actually understand the war against all Puerto Ricans and how he lays it out here, as Jose Lopez said, the way he's able to articulate it and bring all these elements, and most of us know the historical context, to be able to say, we're all the target. I don't care if you're, tú sabes, si eres anexionista, si eres independentista, si eres estadolibrista, si eres realengo, aquí no quieren joder a todo. Let me put it to you, simple as that. And if you can't identify, I think most people that read it say, wait a minute, I see myself here. So there's no one, and I've heard him do several presentations, and every time that I hear him, it's something different that I've missed, and that I go back and read the book again to a part. So, con mucho respeto y mucho cariño y mucho entusiasmo, Nelson Antonio Denis para volver a
I think that it's a real honor to be here, and this is like a who's who and a rose gallery at the same time. So I think I'm in great company when Harrison Lee said that just wrote my epitaph. It's Nelson Denis, he gets in trouble. It's about right. We'll talk about that. But I'll talk a little bit about history, and I'll try to explain why I think it's very dynamic and important to us today. As I was writing this book, War Against All Puerto Ricans, I started learning how to be a historian. And I realized that the word history sometimes evokes this, oh my God, I gotta remember these days, this. But history is actually a very living thing. We apply it. It's the word, we used the word organic before. It's an organic thing. It's part of how we live. When I reach my hand here and lift this up to talk about Oscar Lopez Rivera, it's history because I remembered that I put it here. When I reach for something, when I get my keys, history is part of how we live. When I wake up in the morning and put on my pants, whatever, it's because the history is what I learned the day before. Going to school, every part of our life, of our evolution, is history, because we build on our knowledge of what we learned the day before. So everything, in a sense, everything is history. It's not a dead thing. It's part of, it's who we are. It's how we get forward in life. And our ability to apply history defines our capacity to succeed in life and to identify who we are and what we want out of life. So in a sense, history is like water. It's what we swim in. And I started to feel that more and more in a big way as I started researching this book. And I realized that like water, that history has surrounded me all my life. I didn't realize that I had been writing this book without realizing it for 40 years. I took some time, a year off from college. I went up to Puerto Rico, mi familia de Caguas. And I had a family member that was a nationalist, y conocía al Visu. And I started talking to him. That was in 1974. I didn't know I was writing a book. But that was my own personal history. I was really curious. You know, I was at that point, I was 20 years old, and you know, I was starting to hear these things for the first time. It was really exciting. With a 20-year sensibility, it was more the James Bond aspect. You know, wow, ¿qué es lo que pasó en el 50? And la carpeta, and the cops and robbers. And it was, you know, but then as you mature, you know, there's a more profound sense of what it involves. I talked to more people, and one person led to another. In finalizing the history of this book, I want to recognize Congressman Jose Serrano, because he used his leverage on the House Appropriations Subcommittee to convince the FBI Director, Louis Freeh, to release 1.8 million pages of our history. That history is las carpetas. Those carpetas were kept on 100,000 people, 100,000 Puerto Ricans on an island of only about that, at that time, 2 million. That's a lot. So you look around you can see the numbers that out of this group here, there would be 4 about 4 people that would have a carpeta, and about 2 or 3 other people for each one of those that would be an informant. It gives you an idea of the sickness that was brought onto our island, and that was part of our history. So I'll just walk you through a little bit of history, because I think it's a living thing, and it gives us some tools with which to approach some of our problems and issues today. And as part of my history, I have a childhood friend here named Luis Lebron, who put up with me for 50 years. I'm really happy to see you, Luis. Thank you. History. When the United States first came and occupied in 1898, I'm obviously a history guy because I don't know much about PowerPoint. So here's my PowerPoint. This is the way that they arrived. This was the inauguration of the first civilian governor, Charles Herbert Allen. And this is, if people wonder why during the Puerto Rican Day Parade there's so many flags and there's such a relationship to our flag, it's because for 10 years, if you owned the flag in Puerto Rico, you could go to jail for having a flag this size in your closet, in your home. And because when the United States came, evidently they appreciated the value of symbolism because they wrapped La Fortaleza like a Christmas present, and this is the first governor. So this is how the United States landed and how they rolled from the beginning. And then they rolled quickly. In 1899, there was a hurricane, San Ciriaco, largest hurricane in the century. It devastated the island's coffee crop. It left nearly 100,000 people homeless. The United States sent no hurricane relief, no real help. To the opposite, the following year, in 1900, they declared that the Puerto Rican peso, which was of equal buying power internationally, was no longer valid. It had to be turned into, for dollars, American dollars, and that each a Puerto Rican peso was worth 60 American cents. So overnight, by legislative fiat, they devalued the ownership, the wealth, the property of every Puerto Rican on the island by 40%. You think about it, you're an economist, you're dealing with the Martin Peña channel, you're dealing with dollars and budgets all the time. Think of if all of a sudden everybody in this room, in this country, and you go home and you find out that you have 40% less money in the bank account, that your house is worth 40% less, that the money that you're receiving from your employer, your income, even though it's the same income, is worth 40% less. Well, the country wouldn't function, not for long. There'd be some pretty serious problems right away. There'd be riots. Everything would stand still. Think about how this country was affected when the World Trade Center's towers went down. Horrible tragedy. It was 2 buildings, the 2 largest buildings, but it was 2 buildings that had an enormous ripple effect throughout the world. Well, think about a 40% devaluation of every human being in this country, what that would do. Well, that's what was done in Puerto Rico 1 year after the United States got there. 2 years. That's 1901. 1900. 1901, the Hollander Act was a law passed that presented a steeply graduated set of property taxes to everyone in Puerto Rico, and it especially hit the farmers. So you had this perfect storm. You had this economic trifecta. The hurricane, the currency devaluation, and the Hollander Act. What that led to is desperation throughout the island, and farmers logically needed money. They clearly went out and had to get loans. The main lending source was, and it was appropriately titled, the American Colonial Bank, was the name of it. There was no usury law restrictions. So when the farmers went to the bank, they received predatory loans akin to the 2007 mortgage crisis. Within a matter of 5 to 10 years, the defaults were rampant throughout the island, and they lost their farms. And within 15 to 20 years, United States banking syndicates owned 80% of the arable land in Puerto Rico. By 1920, 80%. And they turned a diversified agriculture, coffee, tobacco, pineapples, sugar, into a one-crop cash cow economy, that of sugarcane. Because economies of scale, where that you create everything like a factory, and you make more money. It was just capitalism at work. So by the 1930s, we have a really severe situation where people who own their land no longer own the land. Some of them aren't even working the land because they didn't need as many workers. So they might, and this is where the diaspora begins. It was first an internal diaspora. You have the development of an internal urban proletariat. Well, logically, you then, if people are starving, they need wages, you pass minimum wage legislation. The legislature did that. But because the U.S. Congress has plenary jurisdiction over Puerto Rico, we can't pass a single law that can't be vetoed by the Congress. The U.S. Congress vetoed the minimum wage legislation. And then in 1922, in Balzac v. Puerto Rico, the United States Supreme Court deemed that the Constitution of the United States did not apply to Puerto Rico. Even though in 1917, under the Jones Act, we were citizens so we could go fight in World War I. So we have Puerto Ricans who were citizens in 1917, but 5 years later don't get the privileges and immunities of the U.S. Constitution. And they can't get minimum wages. So this is how the situation is evolving. And people started realizing that, you know, hasta los campesinos, los jíbaros, todos empiezan a entender that, you know, there's something, this isn't what the bargain, this isn't what we were told when General Nelson Miles arrived in Guanica and then hoisted the flag up in Ponce and said, we are going to bestow upon you the blessings of an enlightened civilization. This is a whole other story that's unfolding here. So people started trying to organize, but the United States, that's not the way what the United States wanted. So the first time that there was an island-wide agricultural strike, the United States was able to sort of buy off the leadership. It was the FLT, la Federación Liberal Libre de Trabajadores. Well, the rank and file found out that they were being sold out by members of the FLT who were trying to get themselves a position, good jobs for themselves and their families in the government, and contracts with the Puerto Rican government for their own little favorable agricultural deals, that they were being sold out by the leadership. It is at that point that they went to Albizu Campos, the first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard, first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard Law School, president of the Nationalist Party, and at that time, apparently, the one man in the island that they felt that they could trust, that walked the walk, that is and did and lived what he said, what he believed. So they went to him, and he led the strike. And in fact, they won this striking victory. The wages doubled from 75 cents a day to $1.50 a day for a 10-hour workday. That was a stunning thing. Their wages doubled. The economy was shut down for 3 or 4 months during this strike in late '34 and early 1935, and in the middle of the Great Depression. And this news rocked Wall Street, because there was a lot of investment in these Puerto Ricans. There was like a cash cow, a lot like the hedge fund people that own some of the public debt of Puerto Rico now. It's a cash cow. There's a John Paulson, but in 1935, when that word went out, Albizu Campos led this strike. That's when things changed on the island. Albizu had been advocating, editorializing, organizing for 10, 15 years in Puerto Rico, but he was ignored by the United States. Otro loco, en la casa lo conocen. But suddenly they recognized him when he won this strike, and that's what the turning point, in my view, a turning point in Puerto Rico's history was that agricultural strike. Because at that point, the United States flipped. They realized now, okay, we're not dealing with, unos pendejos aquí. There's something going on in that island. They sent down a new governor, Governor General Blanton Winship, a U.S. general, Army general, and a new police chief named E. Francis Riggs. E. Francis Riggs, interesting guy, graduated from Yale, Skull and Bones, the same secret society as George Bush. His father was the president of the Riggs National Bank. And here's a picture of it. It's the building is still there. It sits across the street from the U.S. Treasury Department. And the Riggs National Bank was pretty famous for helping to fund disguised right-wing takeovers that were disguised as revolutions. They helped the United Fruit Company go in and take over a number of governments throughout South and Central America. The Riggs National Bank laundered money for a lot of those dictators, and they were finally shut down when they were caught laundering money for the Chilean dictator Agustín Pinochet. And that was finally when it became too much, and it was too obvious, and the bank was shut down. But the president of the Riggs Bank sent his son, E. Francis Riggs, to be the chief of police of Puerto Rico immediately after this strike. And that is that's where you get the title of my book. Because they immediately rearmed the police force. They had literally Tommy gun training on the weekends to teach local police people to shoot their own brother on their own land. And very soon you have what was called the Rio Piedras massacre, where the police assassinated 3 nationalists in broad daylight. And he held, Police Chief Riggs held a press conference to explain it. And again, as an expression of the American attitude, they didn't need to feel that they needed to explain or to apologize or contextualize. They said it, at least, sometimes you appreciate it when they say it honestly, because this guy said it honestly. He said to the press, well, if Albizu Campos continues to agitate the sugarcane workers, there's going to be war to the death against all Puerto Ricans. So the words and the title of this book came from the chief of police in Puerto Rico when he told all Puerto Ricans, you better get in line or we're going to shoot you. That's simple. And they kept their promise, because a year and a half later, when Albizu Campos went to jail, he basically went to jail for leading that agricultural strike. They took him on charges of seditious conspiracy against the United States. But since we know that basically the business of America is business, he went to jail for conspiring against United States business interests. That's what he went to jail for. In Ponce, a year and a half later, there was a peaceful march on Palm Sunday on behalf of Albizu and to celebrate the Nationalist Party and to sing La Borinqueña. And they were told, it was actually, in my view, it was a trap. Because if you don't want them to march, you don't give them a permit and then withdraw it at the last minute. In my view, the Nationalist Party was given that permit because they knew that people would come from all from the island and be there in one place. Because what happened is that you had a very well orchestrated killing zone. You had Tommy gunners up here and a whole phalanx of police down here trapping it so that if you're trying to stop a riot or something, you give people an avenue to go out. You say, please, clear the street, we're not going to have this is not, you don't have a permit, you got to get out of here. But Louis, you did parade duty, and Louis was the lieutenant at several precincts, and he was a community affairs director, and he knows that when you're at a parade, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, you don't put Tommy gunners up here and police down here and then start shooting. That's not how you stop it, Well, that's what they did. And they did it for almost 15 minutes, and they killed 17 men, women, and unarmed men, women, and children, and injured wounded over 200 others. This is known as the Ponce Massacre. So this is sort of just real quick. So afterwards, though, I'm sorry, I get caught up in my presentation. They rearranged the corpses. There was one policeman who got caught in the crossfire, and they put him in different pictures because they had the newspaper El Mundo under their control. So el capitán trajo his name was Angel Feliciano, the photographer. He said, you take these photos. So they rearranged this corpse right here in a series of photos to make it look like they were shooting at non-existent nationalists because there's no one there. And they did it again here. They took the same corpse and put it in another picture. And the island press caught on to this. They thought it was so ridiculous that they made a cartoon out of it with a cheap photographer so that they can all say cheese, looking up, and then the caption underneath, ahora podemos decir que estaban disparando de la azotea. Now we can say that they were shooting at us from the rooftops. So that was the feeling, because the way it was is that what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, but what happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. It was like that. We were separated by an ocean, a language, a culture, 400 years of Ibero-American history, and a technology. The technology was, there was no television, barely any radio, certainly no internet. It was information was controlled by basically 5 or 6 wire service reporters, AP and UPI. So you could pretty much do what you wanted and then say something else up in the United States. So that is some of the history. I know that I don't have too much time left. The book is it centers on that history, that economic underpinning, how Albizu Campos dealt with that, how they came to have the revolution in 1950 to try to change that. And quickly, just so you know, the United States dealt with that very severely. They deployed 5,000 National Guard soldiers, arrested 3,000 Puerto Ricans, and bombed 2 towns in broad daylight, Jayuya and Utuado. This is the information that didn't come up here. We heard up here that the nationalists burned their own cities, where they, their families, their neighbors, and friends lived. That doesn't happen. That's just not make. There's no common sense in that. They bombed Utuado and arrested 3,000 Puerto Ricans. Arrested them even in their pajamas on the road. Arrested them at gunpoint throughout San Juan. It was in this context that that revolution occurred. And the application now, I'm going to fast forward now, the application now to today is, just think about this. At the beginning, the United States created a great deal of stress on the island. It shook things up, and then out of that came all this property filtering down into the hands of the banks within 20 or 30 years. What I see now is I see a lot of stress as well. They told the government of Puerto Rico that if you inflict all sorts of government austerities, pension rollbacks, laying off 23,000 workers, property taxes, income taxes, excise taxes, water and utility rates going up, 2 gasoline hikes in the last year, a 16% IVA. They were discussing a fat tax. If you're too heavy, to fine you. It is so crazy. They said if you do all these things, we will not downgrade your debt. These things were done, but the Wall Street rating service is still downgraded to junk bond status. And so now the government, again, está apretando, look for money for here, for there. At the same time that in 2012, Act 22 was passed, which gives a 20-year tax exemption for interest, dividend, and capital gains income to foreign investors. One of the leaders of which is a fellow named John Paulson, who made $15 billion for his hedge fund here in the United States in 2000, betting against the United States economy, betting against homeowners, creating these credit default swaps and asset-based lending instruments that they knew were going to implode, that people were going to lose their homes. They bet against us. John Paulson now is the lead investor in Puerto Rico. He's developing a $500 million resort on Dorado Beach. He's been given, and under Act 22, he gets a 20-year tax exemption from all his profits. The New Yorker magazine, New York Times magazine, but 2 or 3 others that I can't remember, Bloomberg News, are all leading the charge. How this great thing, the future of Puerto Rico is tourism. We need more American investment. So at the same time that Governor Garcia Padilla is meeting with these guys and bringing them down and giving them a 20-year tax abatement, we have people that can't afford to live, and they're leaving the island. If you think that Brooklyn has been gentrified, I think what we're seeing is a gentrification of an entire island. And we need to now think about Albizu Campos, and we all, as one, have to become Albizu Campos and take back our island. Thank you.